The elusive figure, White Owl, made himself known in the Sword and Staff Discord servers in November 2023. There's a bit of a mystery around him in our community, and very few of us know his name in real life. The conversation you are about to hear took place on February 17th of 2025, and at the time of recording, I still hadn't met him, nor did I know his name. And now that I do, I've been sworn to secrecy. After listening to this episode, you might understand why. Sometimes in our little neck of the woods, folks may see patterns that are not particularly popular with the folks in the mainstream. Only recently have many in the Reformed Christian world begun to reacquaint themselves with the idea of any unseen realm that has any meaningful connection to the material aspects of reality. For those at the forefront, the visionaries and early adopters, if you will, talking about UFO and UAP phenomena in any way that is not a simple dismissal can get you immediately blacklisted with friends, family, employers, etc. But today, that's exactly what we'll be talking about. So if you're interested in hearing about UFOs, UAPs, the goddess Hathor, the intoxicating temptation of the esoteric, and the relationship between the tribes of Israel and the Zodiac, all while staying tethered to a distinctively Christian framework, then stick around. This is UFOs, UAPs, and the Cosmic Mirror with White Owl. Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber. I'm one of the elders at Proclaim Church in Bonner Springs, Kansas. Joining me today is our most elusive of friends, Mr. White Owl. White Owl has been a part of our Discord community for a long time now, and it's been sort of a game for all of us to figure out exactly who White Owl is. Some people know, and they haven't told me yet, so we'll have to try and figure it out tonight. We've chosen in this episode to continue to keep White Owl's identity anonymous for the sake of continuing that mystery, but I'll let White Owl introduce himself either way. Divulge as much as or as little as you want in your little introduction here. So, White Owl, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, everyone. Sword and Staff listeners. My first time on the podcast. I am from Minnesota. I live in St. Paul. I'm married and have 4 kids, a son and 3 daughters. And yeah, I guess my connection to Sword and Staff came about through just researching, looking into some kind of odd topics like UFOs and things like that. And I just stumbled upon it, and I joined a little over a year ago and quickly realized that you guys were definitely my people. I'm of the Reformed stripe. I'm a Baptist, but did my undergrad at Bethlehem College and Seminary. So I had a focus in biblical and theological studies there, and it's a little more intense than most undergrad programs. So I actually did a number of semesters of Greek as well as Hebrew. So I'm a novice, but I have studied a little bit into the languages, and I'm very interested in connecting some of these weird topics into grounding them biblically. So I'm trying to look at the Bible and look at some of the kind of phenomena that people experience out in the world and say, I don't think the explanations out there are sufficient. I think that the Bible actually explains these things. And so I'm always looking for connections that you start with the text itself, you're exegeting, and then you're working your way out, and you might notice things along the way that connect to what you're reading. And I think that's true in the topic we're going to cover tonight.
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction. And, people might be a little bit confused, about having an anonymous guest, but just to kind of reassure everybody that White Owl has definitely been one of our heaviest hitters in our Discord community for some time. I've been trying to get him on the podcast since early in season 1, and as a few folks and I were starting to talk about revamping the podcast and asking, who from the Discord should we get on, almost everybody immediately said, you got to get White Owl on. So, and just as a little peek behind the curtain, White Owl and I were talking about beforehand, he's got like a whole mind map of ideas. If you're not familiar with what a mind map is, it's a little difficult to explain, but if you know what a mind map is, then you understand kind of the level of thinking that the kind of person who just recreationally puts together mind maps has. It just kind of links a bunch of ideas together in a format that's a little bit easier to read. But yeah, I've only seen it from some pretty high level people in the industry that I work in. So maybe that's a clue to identity as well. But we'll try and figure that out later. So one of the biggest contributions, though, that White Owl has made is some of our discussions around things like UFOs and UAP phenomena, some of the disclosures that have been coming out, and some of their overlap that they seem to have, at least, with the things in the unseen realm or the topics that we talk about when we're thinking about the unseen realm. So, as a jumping off point, I'm going to have White Owl tell us a little bit about a particular family, the Bledsoe family. I think I'm saying that right. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
All right. So go ahead, tell us about that family.
Okay. So I guess before I do too, I just want to preface this with we're probably going to get really specific here, and we're going to talk about some really weird stuff, and then we're going to zoom way out and cover a lot of biblical topics. So it's going to be a little bit of a inversion from how I'd probably normally approach things.
Great.
Yeah. So this story, the reason it particularly piqued my interest is I encountered, I think first, Chris's son, Ryan Bledsoe, and he has a podcast called Bledsoe Said So, and they dive into all kinds of esoteric, occult, Gnostic philosophy and religion, and they just discuss the whole gamut of things that you can imagine in this world, but from a completely opposite perspective to us, which is probably pretty common. I first discovered him, though, on Danny Jones' podcast. So I was listening to Danny Jones, and he has crazy titles about how NASA is trying to open time portals to the past with biblical time machines or something, and then the video has nothing to do with that.
It's all true, though, right?
It's all true. Yeah, that's another thing I should say. I don't assume that necessarily everything that these people say is true. And I just want to be clear on that I'm not going into this when I describe these events. We're going to try to be a little discerning here and feel out what's really going on. But to the story, Ryan is talking about how his dad, Chris, is one of the most, I guess you could say, chronic experiencers of UFO contact and abductions and these messages that are being received supposedly from some kind of non-human intelligence, NHI, as people call it. And as he started describing this story, you'll find common themes in a lot of these stories about things that sound like beings of light and orbs and all kinds of things, and not just the classic metallic flying saucers that everybody knows, or the little gray people, little gray aliens, but other things that sound much more supernatural. And so that piqued my interest right away. And then he is going on to describe how they think these things are beings of light. And of course, that just seemed very subversive to me, thinking about the Bible and Satan appearing as a being of light. And I start questioning, okay, what's really going on here? Where is the connection point? Because the things that they're describing, they're saying, we're not Christians. We don't believe in these classical Christian beliefs, but we're using language that just is so reminiscent of Scripture and echo Scripture, but we're turning it on its head. And so whenever people start doing that, I start taking it a little more seriously, where I start thinking about, this seems like it's probably something that is actually spiritual, that is actually trying to subvert Christianity in some way. And it's not just someone who's looking for attention necessarily, even, again, if you question some of the things that they might say. So then listening to his father, Chris, he tells these stories about 18 years ago, he started having these contact experiences. He was at a horrible spot in his life. He had Crohn's disease. He lost all his money in the recession because he was in construction and housing, and he was just in this awful spot. And he goes out fishing with his son and I think 3 other friends, and they live in North Carolina, so they're at Cape Fear River. And what winds up happening on this night is Chris goes off by himself for a little while into the woods, and he starts praying. So they are charismatic Christians, and they were Bible Belt people. And given some of their descriptions, I don't know how deeply they understood the Bible, but they were going to church, and they definitely have read the Bible. They allude to that numerous times. But Chris starts praying, and he's asking for some kind of help, some kind of relief from these struggles that he's going through. And then as he's wandering through the woods, he comes up on this hill and he sees two lights that at first he thinks it's one. He thinks it's the sun, and he thought it was the sun setting because it was kind of dusk. And then he realizes there's two. And then he just immediately feels fear because he realizes there's something weird going on and he doesn't know what it is. Long story short, in this first encounter, he winds up having all this missing time where he's been gone for 4 hours, and he stumbles back to the camp. He doesn't really remember anything. He's wondering where his son is, and these friends have lit a fire, and he goes, I've only been gone for 20 minutes. And they go, no, you've been gone for 4 hours. And they don't know where his son is because he went off looking for him in the woods, his teenage son. And the other interesting piece of this story is that both Chris and not his son Ryan, but Chris Jr., his older son, both wind up encountering weird things in the woods. So Chris winds up seeing these things that would be more classic gray aliens, and he winds up basically he explained it as he couldn't move. So he sees one of them, and then he gets locked in place just looking at this thing for hours. And he can't move. And then eventually Chris, when he comes back, he goes out looking for his son, and he finds him, and they just go, we've got to get out of here. And the other friends that are with them, even in recent interviews, people have gone and talked to them and asked them about this, because what winds up happening is that they're chased by these crafts that are flying over them, and they chase them all the way back to their home. And these guys are arguing about which one of them is going to get to go home and see his family first and tell them that basically it's the end of the world or something like that, because they're so afraid. And these guys on camera will talk about this and attest to they weren't involved in all this stuff in the woods, but they definitely saw these craft. And so you have all these witnesses who are seemingly reliable, having these experiences. That's the first one. That's the first kind of initiatory step that happens. Later, Chris starts having these weird encounters where these things are beings of light or tall gray aliens are in their house, in his yard, everywhere. And they show up at random times. And it's just such a strange story when you hear it. But and keep in mind, this guy is claiming that he's a fairly relatively uneducated guy involved in construction who has never studied anything esoteric. He's never studied ancient religion. He has no idea what any of this stuff is, and he's just having these really odd experiences. So I can't remember the whole timeline, but at some point, he at night winds up going outside because there's all this commotion. They have these dogs in kennels, and he winds up coming face to face again with some of these beings, and they take him on a craft, which is described as this orb type thing or a plasma type thing on the outside. But then when you go inside, it's actually some type of spaceship. And these tall gray aliens bring him to see this figure he describes as the lady. And when the lady enters in, that's when things start becoming much more in the Gnostic esoteric realm. Because
yeah, they do.
this figure is a figure that has been seen throughout history, is reported. People have had contacts with this lady figure, and there's all kinds of stories that you could, if you just look up, encounters with, and even people connect it to like Marian visions and things like that, where people think that they're encountering Mary. And there's been things in like South and Central America where people mass sightings of some female figure who delivers weird messages to them, and no one can explain it. It's a very odd phenomenon. But he winds up getting from this lady this message that basically she is the goddess Hathor from Egyptian mythology. And she is wearing this dress that's covered in stars, and she is essentially a member of the Trinity. And again, you just start hearing these things that are just so directly attacks on any type of scriptural worldview, where it's again this type of Gnostic perspective where there's this hidden knowledge that they're encountering, where they're saying, these supposed beings are saying that you don't really understand what's going on, and we're going to illuminate you. We're going to help you understand what's really happening. And we're going to talk about how there is no ultimate God. There is no true God. There's actually a ultimate consciousness. And so they start talking about things in these podcasts about Christ consciousness and all these different things that are trying to remove any type of personhood or authority from Jesus, and claim that, oh no, he was really teaching about things like reincarnation, and people edited these texts, and you can just go down this crazy rabbit hole that they go down.
Now, before we go too much farther, you used the term there, Christ consciousness. Is that kind of like that universal Christ concept that has been floating around the past couple of years?
Yeah, I haven't ever delved into exactly what a specific person might mean by that, but when they explain it, it seems like this sense of everyone can be like this. So it's not actually something that is unique to Christ or that has anything to do with him being God. It's actually much more something like a Hindu or a Buddhist type conception of morality, where you're trying to be the best version of yourself. And that it's called Christ consciousness, I think, because people point to it as Christians think Jesus is really saying all these things about himself, and really he's saying it about how you should act only. It's really about how you should live, and how people call Jesus a good moral teacher, which has interesting ties with liberalism and theology, where they're trying to put forward this idea that he's not really unique. He's not a God man. He is just a good man, and that we can be like him. And that's really what it's all about. It doesn't have anything to do with true salvation or, salvation and condemnation or anything like that.
That almost sounds kind of like where Russell Brand was before he has seemingly, to be determined, but seemingly become a legitimate Christian.
Yeah. I think it's the exact same thing, where there's this just widespread teaching of, I'm going to think about Jesus, and I'm going to consider the things that I think were nice that he said, but I'm not actually going to be confronted by Jesus. I'm not actually going to submit to him as the ultimate authority in my life. I'm just going to try and act morally. And people don't really have any basis for that outside of their own judgment and picking and choosing what they like. But so back to the lady. She tells him that these beings, her and these other beings, work for creation. So essentially illuminating that same idea of this sort of consciousness, this sort of amorphous idea of something intelligent that they serve or work for, and that she and these other beings are actually the ones who created humanity, and there is no true God or the Trinity in the way that we think about it, but that they are the ones who are guiding our evolution, and that they're basically coming back, they're initiating contact in order to kind of lead us into this new age of peace and prosperity. And, classic tropes like that.
Yeah, always the temptation, right?
Right, exactly. What's interesting too about Chris is that he claims that these things healed him of his Crohn's disease. And I've never, I have not seen medical records or anything like that, but that is one of his claims. It's claimed by him and his family members. It's claimed by multiple people who knew him that it's gone now. And just to make a little bit of a connection too with Chris is, this guy is showing up when you hear about congressional meetings where they're talking about disclosure and talking about these UFO topics. He is one of the guests that comes to these events, and he's out there shaking hands with your senators, and he's talking to them about these ideas. And so it's highly concerning to me that someone like that, whether he's telling the truth or whether he's trying to manufacture some type of belief in something like this,
Mm.
that's really concerning to me, that he's that entrenched and knows all these people so well and is just so seemingly involved kind of in these discussions.
Well, that seems to verify some of the claims of it's Ryan is the son, right?
Yep.
I was watching some things that you had sent over, and I think it was that other podcast I can't remember, which Danny Jones I think was the podcast that he was on.
Yeah, that's right.
And he was making these claims like, yeah, everybody in the intelligence community knows dad, like they're all this way, they're all very esoteric, things like that. And then you hear those things and you think, well, I bet he thinks that, right? But then you're saying like, no, this guy is like talking to Congress about these things. He's like, he seems to actually, be legit in that aspect, at least.
Yeah. I could talk a little bit more about that. I think the last thing I'll say, and you can, if you want to hear more about this experience, I'm hesitant sometimes to send people to really listen to too much of this stuff, because I think it can send you down a weird pathway in your mind. But obviously I have, and I think it can be helpful if you're in a good mind state for it.
Yeah.
But the last thing I'll say about the lady, and not go too deep into all the information that comes out, is she meets with him, according to him, every year on Good Friday, which of all the times that could happen, it's just this, another kind of like, okay, what's going on here? Where the darkest day of the Christian calendar, right, where Jesus is in the grave, is when this supposed lady shows up and is bestowing wisdom on humanity. I mean, what better evil spirit thing to do?
Yeah, that's wild. One of the things that you were talking about that was interesting to me, and I picked this up when I was listening through one of those podcasts too. Ryan was talking about how, his dad was healed, verifiable or not, I don't know, right? I didn't go down figuring out whether or not he was actually sick, and now he's well. But he also made the claim that his dad would get like prophetic visions about people who were also sick or, hurt or something like that. And he would be given essentially like esoteric prescriptions, if you want to call it that, in order for these people to be well. And it kind of pricked my memory, because I've been doing a bunch of studying right now. I've been reading several books and doing a lot of study in different places right now for the whole Pagan America season 2 stuff, right? The more documentary things. And there were some similarities that stood out to me from one of the experiences that I read. I've been reading this book, which is wild, and I think you would probably love it. It's called, I'm going to butcher how it's said, because I don't know how to speak whichever of the native languages this is, but it's called Mitakuye Oyasin, which means we are all related, or we're all brothers, or something like that, right? But basically, it's this guy's story about how he was like a college professor. He's of native descent, but grew up like on a Christian like boarding school, or in a Christian boarding school on a reservation, all these different things. So he grew up Christian, right? Which there's already a similarity there. But he started having some different experiences. He got married to another Native American, and she was a lot more ingrained in the culture. And so he ended up getting sick. He had like some sort of swelling in his foot, and the doctors couldn't figure it out, and all these different things. And, he had been doing some more study on his past and his culture and things like that. And his wife was like, well, why don't we go take you to do a healing service at the reservation? It's like, well, I've never done that before. And so he goes and he does this thing, because he's like, okay, well, may as well. Medicine is failing me. So he describes this service, and there's a guy there who's like a medicine man or shaman. And it's in a sweat lodge. I've learned a lot about sweat lodges through this study.
Yeah, I bet you have.
It's in a sweat lodge. And what he describes happening in that is, this guy is there and he's not really actually doing any of the healing that happens. He basically gets wrapped up in a bundle of blankets, and there's like, 11 secret herbs and spices that are smoking, whatever they
Yeah.
are. But this guy basically says it gets hotter and hotter as they pour more hot water on the stones, and there are these songs that are being sung. And he's talking about how he can tell that they're spiritual songs and not just normal songs. And essentially what happens is this guy passes out, but wakes up in an altered state, okay, which is very common in these sorts of experiences. But he is visited by spirits, and the spirits are described as beings of light flying around. They're not talking to him directly, though. He can hear them, but they're not talking directly to him. They're not telling him what to do. He ends up waking up from this experience, and the guy who's the shaman, who's been all bundled up and like totally passed out, silent, he can't like talk to him or anything like that. He wakes up and then gives him like a set of things to do in order to be well. And it doesn't happen immediately. It takes like 30 days, but sure enough, this guy's feet stop swelling and all this, stuff that sounds crazy, right? But it's almost exactly like the kinds of experiences that we're hearing these people talking about with UFOs. And I just couldn't help but see that connection there, particularly as I was listening to Ryan talk about his dad describing the dress of, what was it, Hathor? Is that
that's right.
the lady's name?
Yes, the lady.
Yes, the lady's name. Dressed in stars and being beings of light. It's like all of that is just spot on with everything that I'm reading.
Yeah, and Ryan makes that claim. I would argue that, from what I can tell, Ryan has actually gone even further in. Chris is experiencing these things or claiming to, and Ryan is much more researching and learning about esotericism and actually diving into those ideas. And I'm sure there's mutual influence there, but he actually seems much more interested in that than his dad does. I think his dad just is kind of, I've had these really weird experiences and I don't know quite what's going on. And then Ryan is actually the one who's diving into occult knowledge, which is interesting. But he thinks that, and the lady says that she is Hathor, but that she has been known by many names throughout the ages. And Ryan posits that all these things, these spiritual experiences, all these things that we know about as the supernatural phenomena are the same thing. So he's basically giving out this idea that it might take different shapes, it might take different forms at different times, but it's really all the same thing, which is, not that crazy of an idea or that far of a stretch when you start going down these paths of believing that these are incredibly ancient, prehistoric things that have been going on for all ages. But yeah, it's not surprising that there's the similarities, and it again does lend some credibility to why are all these people in all these places in all these times having these experiences, and particularly usually experiences that move them away from Christianity. Why is that kind of the seeming goal of what's going on? And further, I think it's interesting from a biblical standpoint to think about Moses and Aaron or the Apostle Paul, and when they encounter people who are described as performing magic. In the case of Moses and Aaron, it's the court magicians in Egypt who can turn their staves into serpents, and then Moses or Aaron also do the same and it consumes them. Or in Acts with Paul is being used as a foil, or rather magicians are being used as a foil against Paul, where they're doing these signs and wonders. He shows up at one place and there's a magician named Bar Jesus who Paul makes go blind. And he performs this act that is basically a counter to what this guy is doing. And he essentially curses him and, is saying, "Be gone." And there's this foil happening where these guys are actually practicing magic. They're doing things that really do work,
Yeah.
but all with the goal of people submitting and worshiping these other gods. And I think that's something as Christians that we don't always understand. We kind of think these other religions, these other people, it's all fake. And there's not actually anything to it. But if you really take a step back and look at a biblical worldview, what's being claimed is just that these things are powerless compared to God, and that they are trying to keep you from Him. They're trying to keep you from worshiping the true God, not that they don't exist or don't have any type of power or even the ability to heal.
Yeah.
Jim Jordan actually talks about the idea. It was in a lecture I listened to where he's at Theopolis, if people don't know who he is.
Uh-huh.
He talked about the idea that he even thinks that some of these encounters that people have had throughout the ages in these pagan places, when there's a good outcome, like a healing medicine, that some of those things may have actually been general revelation, and that some of these things could actually be angels who are delivering something like medicine as a gift to humanity, but then the people are actually turning around and worshiping them, and they weren't supposed to do that. And so it's this kind of, there's two things going on, two levels going on of God may allow certain things like that. That's speculative, obviously, but it was a way he was saying of why would bad spirits, evil spirits, be gifting good things to men and not just trying to harm them. And I have some other theories on that we could circle around to later, but it's just an interesting idea that we don't fully understand the complexities of the spiritual world, and we shouldn't pretend to. And I just think it's worth kind of opening up your mind a little bit from a biblical perspective and saying, what could be going on here? What could be happening? But when they're showing up and just straight up lying to you, that's a different story.
Yeah. I had two thoughts when you were talking just now. One was about kind of that, hey, maybe there's healings that happen that are kind of in not the ways that you would expect. Not like, God using Moses to touch someone, or Peter's handkerchief or or shadow or whatever, things like that. Right. But one that stands out to me is the serpent, the bronze serpent, and the Israelites looking upon the bronze serpent, and how that's actually meant for their good. It's like a gift. And that sounds distinctively magical, right? I mean, that makes, there's no way we can just like science that one away. It's not like, oh yes, looking at it, they forced them to, receive more vitamin D from sun rays for longer, and that must have helped them over a period of time. No, it just straight up says they looked at it and were made well,
Yeah.
But that becomes a problem for them later, right? They become, it becomes an object of worship. So I think you're right that kind of thing can happen. I think James Jordan is correct that sometimes God may use miraculous things as a gift, but then humanity ends up worshiping or distorting that. So that was one of the things that I thought was like a biblical proof of that. Another thing that I think is a biblical proof, I'm not sure how aware of this you are or not, but you mentioned the court magicians, right? Of Pharaoh in Egypt, and they're sort of like, wizards duel that they have with Moses and Aaron and their staffs. And we've actually been going through Exodus at our church, and so we've been talking about, well, no, real stuff's happening there. God's actually, throwing down the gods of Egypt and things like that, which is great. But a lot of people are kind of like, even if they go there, like, okay, that's fine. But later on, and I looked it up to make sure I was given the right, citation here, but in 2 Timothy, Paul talks about them. And if you don't know like Jewish tradition and lore, you don't get that Paul is talking specifically about them. He kind of mentions the magicians and things, and you kind of go, okay, yeah, that's fine. But he calls them out by name. And I think that's interesting because Exodus does not give us their names. The Jewish folklore does. And their names are Janus and Jambres. And Paul gives those names, right? As we have in other places in scripture that, reference other Jewish folklore or pseudoepigrapha and things like that. But he actually gives their names. And that's sort of, as with other things in scripture, we're sort of left to go, okay, well, what's Paul doing? Is he saying like, yeah, generally what Jewish folklore says about these people is true? Or is he saying, or is he just using the names that people know in order to point to them? It might be kind of a mix of both, but the story about Janus and Jambres in Jewish folklore is wild. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they basically are okay. So they basically are like incredible magicians, which I think is the point, and probably why Paul is bringing it up is because in Jewish folklore they are so incredible, and Moses and Aaron overcame them, right, by the power of God. In Jewish tradition, what they say about Janus and Jambres is they were basically like looking for the most powerful sigil magic possible. And so they create these sigils, and they put them on this magic talisman, and they basically end up fighting angels and like absorbing their power, sort of thing. It's kind of difficult to explain, but they break into heaven. That's how powerful they are. They're able to break into heaven, and they break their way all the way up to the top level of heaven before they get to the throne. And they would have beaten, it says Metatron is the highest angel before they get to the throne, right? In the folklore. If you know the folklore, you're following. If you don't know the folklore, you're like totally lost. But essentially, the story goes they break all the way up to the highest level of heaven, and I can't remember how he does it, but Metatron knows that he can't beat them, and he somehow tricks them and gets them to take the talisman off, and he casts them out, and that's the only way that they can be bested. And so I think the point there that Paul is potentially making is, hey, these guys, remember what Moses and Aaron did. Like their magic could not stand against the magic of Yahweh, right? So fascinating story. I'm not saying take it as truth by any means, right? But it's helpful to understand those things to kind of get what the biblical picture is about how they thought about these things at the very least.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you see that in multiple places where it's unclear. Peter and Jude, where they're talking about things like Enoch, and they don't instruct you on how much to import from those books, right? Or what might be going on exactly, but they do allude to them, and it's for good reason. And there's other places like in Acts, Luke alludes to the idea that the servant girl who's possessed by a demon and is prophesying, the word that he uses that doesn't get translated in most translations is actually a spirit of Python. And what he's alluding to is the Oracle of Delphi, where I believe it's Apollos slays a dragon at Delphi, and that is supposedly where like the spirits for the oracles and their prophecies comes from, is this slain dragon, I believe, under the temple there. And so Luke is alluding to an idea, a mythological idea, when he uses that turn of phrase about this girl. And he's writing to Greek readers. And so when he uses things like that, he's not intentionally trying to stay away from it and say just a spirit of prophecy. He's actually seemingly leaning into this cultural conception of this thing has some kind of reality to it. And this girl had that spirit. And I don't think it's just simply a point of common reference, because he could have used other words to explain the concept without picking up on the mythological import that it would have.
Yeah, that's that's I have my opinions about dragons. There are some folks that think they're like basically dinosaurs, and I think you're kind of doing dragons a disservice if that's what you think.
Yeah, we can't go on dragons right now. I have too many thoughts on that.
No dragons. We're on UFOs right now. Okay. I know we've been a little afield, but it's all related, right? So
it is all related. we should circle back and talk a little bit more about the Bledsoes before we move on. There's a bunch of things we've said that will connect, I think, to what we're gonna get into. But just along those lines of some kind of credibility or credence to the story, similar to what we're talking about with this, myths or folklore. You don't know how much of it is exactly true, and yet you do sense that there is a kernel of truth somewhere there.
Right.
And one of the things that Chris does is he takes, I think it's into the hundreds of people now who will come out on the beach in North Carolina with them and watch, and he supposedly can summon these orbs when he asks them to appear, or he knows when they'll be there, and he films them and other people film them. And he took Danny Jones out there, he took another guy, Chris Ramsey, out there, who's a podcaster, and they're seeing these orb things flying around that are not, they don't seem like they have a simple explanation of what they're seeing. And so they're just looking at them and going, what is that? What's going on? And in addition to that, so there's, kind of these witnesses who are showing up, right, and testifying to that they're experiencing something when they're with him. There's also all these 3-letter government agencies that are investigating them. And as crazy as this part sounds, and this is kind of what you were alluding to earlier, is this part sounds just nuts. There's some kind of overlap going on between these government agencies, CIA, NASA, just all these different agencies that are showing up to this guy's house, and they are experiencing this, and they want to know what's going on. And he encounters people who are involved with the infamous Project Blue Book, including a guy named, I think his name's Hal Povenmire, who was, he studied under Werner von Braun. I can't even say his name. Werner von Braun, who was part of Operation Paperclip, who we took from the Nazis. He's a rocket scientist, and we brought him over here. And I have to tell people, this part is not conspiracy theory. It's not.
No, this is all verifiable.
It is fact. Because when I say this to most people who are not in this world, they just don't even believe it right away. They're like, no, that didn't happen. And you find out, no, we co-opted all these Nazi scientists and pardoned them essentially covertly and put them in our space program. So these Nazi scientists are crucial to our space program and us getting to the moon. And I don't want to go overblow things related to NASA and think that it's all occult or something like that, but there is a strange, confusing thread, and I won't get too into it, but the other guy who's the father of the Jet Propulsion Lab, his name's escaping me now. I'm gonna have to look it up, but he was an American, but Jack Parsons, sorry, he was a student of Aleister Crowley, and he was doing summoning magic in the desert, and he literally is the father of jet propulsion, the Jet Propulsion Lab for NASA. And they don't like to talk about this, but he was basically doing 50-50 experimentation with jets and doing all these esoteric rituals in the desert, including something called the Babylon working that his friends knew about, that they experienced seeing UFOs. And then they said, oh, his ritual worked. And that was their takeaway. Is that whatever he was doing out there was summoning these things. And he actually died in a lab explosion at his house. He accidentally killed himself, and there's back and forth on whether or not he was doing a science experiment or alchemical experiment in his lab at his house. So again, whatever you want to think about the truthfulness of, what really was going on there, he was practicing that. And there's this heavy occult connection between some of these agencies and what they're up to.
We're seeing more of that being disclosed now too, right? Like, like in some of it before it was even actually disclosed, you see it in like movies like Men Who Stare at Goats and things like that. And like remote viewing is just becoming a well-known thing that the government is doing. Ryan was talking about hypnotic regression therapies and things like that, which are also very, that's like a very nice clinical way of cleaning up like occultic ritual, in my opinion,
that's right?
right?
I think that's exactly right.
But But we see those things, and we were talking about this earlier. I sent you a video. I think a lot of people have a really hard time understanding that there is a relationship that can happen. There's different schools of science, just like there's kind of different schools in the religious sphere. And I sent you over a video by a guy named Foolish Fish, who is a pagan, like he's esoteric. So I'm not at all saying like, hey, this is good, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying go search this guy out or like follow things, but as I've tried to understand some of these different things, everybody rabbit trails on different things at different times. It was years ago, but he basically talks about there are scientists who believe that like material is kind of the answer to things.
Yep.
And then there's scientists who think that mind is sort of the answer to things. And there's two different ways that they look at that. Typically, the material people tend to think of things in terms of individual ideas and people as like producers of ideas. And then on the other side, they tend to see people as receivers of information from some sort of collective thing. And so in that field of science, right, would be like psychology. In particular, one of the groups or one of the people that really leaned into this was Carl Jung. And this is where he kind of gets into the like universal archetypes, which Jordan Peterson is a big Jungian person. And so people think like, oh, well, Jordan Peterson says a lot of things that sound very Christian. Well, that's because he believes in universal truth. If you are enjoying this episode of Sword and Staff Revenant and want to support the show, then you can head over to swordandstaff.creator-spring.com. We have shirts and mugs in multiple colors, stickers for all of you laptop graffiti artists out there, and even a pint glass for your favorite brew. You can support the show and get something for yourself as well. Links in the show notes and on social. Thank you for your support. That's because he believes in universal truths, right? Yeah. But he actually believes in them in a very wrong way.
And just to interrupt for a second too, Carl Jung wrote on UFOs and actually had quite a bit to say about UFOs and this idea. So it is very connected.
Yeah, well, because it's all related, and I think that there's a reality that the science is there, right? Which what we're saying and what the Bledsoes are saying is, hey, you think the scientific community is measurements and figures and using the metric system instead of the statute system and and all of that and doing a bunch of math and calculating things, but actually the people that are making new advancements are doing things like meditation and things that are actually when they're not when you put the science lens on them, it's like maps of meaning and a psychological analysis and remote viewing, but what they're actually doing is just what magicians have always done, and they're just calling it something different, right? And that's actually happening like all the time at the high levels of science. And just to kind of rabbit trail this a little bit, if people don't believe me, okay, it's pretty well established, at least for listeners of our podcast, that pharmaceuticals, right? Not like, I mean, maybe the normal kind of medicine that RFK is trying to kill, right? But but I'm thinking more like psychedelics and things like that are just well known as like, hey, these have some sort of spiritual implication. That's why people have these incredible experiences, right? But it was really popular in the tech industry, the industry that I'm in, for high-level CEOs to microdose LSD because of the benefits that it gave them in actually doing their job, right? So this is not like some weird little niche idea that we're bringing forward here. This is like very well documented. These people are doing these things.
Yeah, and again, to kind of bring it back to the Bledsoes, I mentioned to you in my mind map that if anyone's familiar with Diana Pasulka, she's a a professor of religious studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And she's written a couple books. One is called American Cosmic, and the other is called Encounters. And she started looking into, I forget the term, but basically accounts of Catholic saints who had strange phenomena that they had seen. And when she went back and looked, I'll try to keep this part short, but she basically found that the ideas that were Christian were frequently inserted into these encounters by the church, and that actually what the people described frequently did not have any connection directly to Mary or Christ or any kind of vision like that. They were seeing strange lights and things that would burn them, and it sounds like they basically got radiation burns, like a lot of people describe who have had supposed encounters with UFOs. And so she started going down this whole rabbit trail, not believing in UFOs at all, and then coming to find out that there are all of these people at places like NASA. And to get back to the Bledsoes, there's a guy who, in American Cosmic, she gives the pseudonym Tyler D for Fight Club, because he's a scientist, a high-level scientist who doesn't necessarily want all his colleagues to be aware of his esoteric practices, even though it all came out eventually, because, you know, nothing's anonymous anymore. But
except for White Owl's identity.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But Chris Bledsoe is the one who introduced Diana Pasulka to this guy whose actual name is Tim Taylor. And people ferreted this out by, in Diana's book, she describes going to the Vatican with Tyler, and she wanted to take him there because the monks, there are astrophysicist monks who they're at the Vatican Observatory, and they are legitimate physicists and astrophysicists, and they study the stars and do science. And she kind of thought, because she is religious, some stripe of Catholicism, I think, she thought that this guy Tyler would have maybe a kind of a conversion experience. And to take a step back, he's describing to her that he interfaces with these machines at NASA and does these protocols where he fasts and meditates and all these different things, and gets supposed downloads from something that he believes to be this higher intelligence. And he has, he's at least a multimillionaire, inventing all of these medical industry startups and technologies that he's supposedly gotten from working with these ideas and these really esoteric concepts, that he's starting all these companies. And he's a very successful NASA mission controller who kind of has the run of the place. When people go with him to NASA, he can drive them around anywhere and take them through any door, essentially. But he started investigating the Bledsoe family. So Ryan recounts this, and that it's just the strangest of connections between this family and NASA and this guy who is looking into theosophy and hierarchies of angels and all these things. And maybe he's Catholic now, but he sees this correlation between the hierarchies of angels in Catholicism and what he supposedly believed before that about these esoteric teachings and his interactions with them. And it's just wild. And but there was a visitor log at the Vatican Observatory. So people went back and looked because they wanted to know who this Tyler guy was. And they found Diana's visitor log and saw who she came with. And then that's how the people figured out it was Tim Taylor.
Oh my goodness. That reminds me of, yeah, I was going to say, that reminds me of, did you watch that Joe Rogan interview with Terrence Howard?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, man.
Yep.
It's one of those things where, you know, kind of like what he was talking about sounds crazy to everybody who has no concept of like what is going on with the esoteric world or hermeticism or anything like that, right? But anybody who's like barely looked over the edge of there's something more than materialism, like that whole the whole time I'm listening to it, I'm like, I get how this guy sounds crazy, but like I think he's like maybe more onto things than people realize. And he too has all these like patents of ideas that he has received through like his his like occultic practice, right? And so
That's
like
right.
none of what you're saying at all surprises me in the
Hmm.
slightest, up
Well,
to and including him going to the Vatican.
that gets that gets back to this idea of you can hear some of these stories and think that they're kind of isolated and unique, but what someone like Diana Pasulka is showing, and others too, is that there's actually a lot of people who talk about this, and it can be artists, it can be people in the tech industry, even famous figures from history who talk about very similar experiences and very similar ideas about that they are having some kind of interaction with some type of intelligence and doing channeling and all these different things. And when you really dig into it, it's just this is classic occultism. This is
Yeah.
paganism, and there's no two ways about it really. But again, that idea that these things aren't just fake.
Yeah.
On the face of them, they do have a reality to them, and that's why they're dangerous. Is not because the Bible is just saying don't do that because it's silly. It's don't do that because it's actually against God's created order, and you're going about things in the wrong way. You're trying to gain knowledge and insight in the wrong way, and I think that's just something we need to be aware of as Christians.
Yeah. Yeah, I've considered that a lot, especially since I've started, since I took over the podcast and I've been, talking with a lot of different people. I've been digging into a lot of different resources and things. I think there's always this temptation, and the best way that I've been able to describe it, this might sound kind of crass, but like there is a Gnostic impulse that is almost like it's almost like a pornographic impulse, right? Like there's something about when there's like this thing that's there that shouldn't be seen or shouldn't be meddled with, that then ups the ante on that temptation. And I think that there tends to be, and this is a thing that I've been thinking about for a while, is there tends to be, when we start looking at these things, this sort of like desire to binge. And it's like, if you look over that wall just a little bit, it's like, well, I just want to dive in. I want to get all of this, right? And that's actually really dangerous. When you start going down these paths, we're saying this as two guys who have clearly, if you've been listening to this podcast for this long, have clearly like gone down some rabbit trails here, right? And you can do it in a safe way. You can do it in a way that's not safe. It's difficult to walk through all of that information and keep your principles and stay tethered to scripture. But it's necessary, or else you start running wild and you start coming up with all kinds of, you start letting that information dictate what scripture means, which is exactly what Gnosticism is.
That's right.
And there's Gnosticism proper, but that Gnostic impulse is in all of this. It just might lead you to something that's not Gnosticism proper, but it will do the same thing, which is it will become an acid that will eat away at a biblical faith. So with that, I think what I want to do now, and I think we were kind of moving this direction too, is let's talk about, the Bledsoes started as like loosely Christian, kind of over in the charismatic camp, but it's not real clear how serious they were about their faith or not. But at least Ryan says like, no, we were talking about these things, and everybody was just kind of shutting us down and saying, well, that's demonic, don't even think about it, sort of thing.
That's right.
Rather than trying to help them actually deal with those experiences from a biblical perspective. So let's maybe take this and then let's start moving down the biblical path. We've talked a few places about how, well, the Bible seems to say that these kinds of experiences happen, maybe under different names. But what are some of the things that we see in Scripture that counteract these things or properly align them and give us the right principles to walk through this information, I suppose?
Yeah.
Which is a super broad topic. I'll let you go wherever you want with it.
Okay. So, and this, I just want to be clear. And again, if you've listened this long, thank you for the patience and hearing out this story as we get to the Christian part, because my intention with this is I want to know about these things so that I can evangelize well. I want to be able to have more to say, because Ryan highlights that these people at their church and in their family would simply say things like, these are demons, this is demonic, and that's kind of where they would leave it. And that's the only answer they have. And I think what you're finding is, even as we're talking, is a lot of these people are kind of sitting there going, I've never seen Jesus. I don't know Jesus, but I have had these experiences. And those are more real to me than whatever truth you think you believe from the Bible. And they just think you don't really understand it, and you don't really have any depth to your understanding. And so they start thinking all this Gnostic information, all this esoteric knowledge is actually kind of popping the hood on what's really going on, and that they have more insight. And I think that's just completely false. So with that, I think I always think we need to start in Genesis.
At the beginning,
everything goes back to Genesis, as it should. So some of these concepts could be kind of new to people. If you really want to talk about it, you should hop in the Discord. This is the only place I interact on these ideas, nowhere else on the internet. So if you have questions or challenges or hate mail, you can send it to me on Discord.
Good plug. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. When God created the world in Genesis, it basically sets up this idea that there is this two-tiered reality. So there is the earth and mankind, and there is the heavens, essentially. And I'm going to be putting forward, as we talk, this idea of what I call the cosmic mirror. And ironically, Ryan Bledsoe talked about this idea from an esoteric perspective in his interview with Danny Jones, which I had forgotten about until I re-listened to it. But it's essentially like what Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, where he's saying, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So there is this copying, mimicry, this fractal reality, as some people have put it, where the things on earth are microcosms or imitations, images of things going on in heaven. And so when God creates the sun and the moon and stars, and he creates man, it notes that the sun and moon and stars are given authority. And this word for authority is the same authority that's given to mankind. So you're getting parallel ideas right at the creation story, and it's describing these things as being put in place to govern, right? They're governing day and night. They're governing times and seasons. Nothing else is described that way. Nothing else is given that type of agency in the creation. And I think it's important to sort of reread Genesis with this mirroring idea and see how mankind is an image of God. And you're getting these people talk about co-regents, vice-regents, how Adam and Eve were essentially priestly figures. And we can go down a whole rabbit trail about this, but the temple that comes later is a cosmological model, and it's a recreation of Eden, but it also represents God's cosmic temple. So it's another image that's put forth on earth where you see this mirrored reality going on. And actually, the book of Hebrews talks about this directly. In Hebrews 9:23 through 24, it says, "Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf." And I would challenge anyone after listening to this episode to go and reread Hebrews with this cosmic mirror in mind, because it's all the confusing parts of, maybe not all of them, but a lot of the confusing parts about Hebrews talking about heavenly beings and the temple and the meaning behind these things are illuminated by this idea that there are images being put forth in the Old Testament of cosmic reality. So back in the garden, you have this, again, two-tiered reality where you're having Adam as the image of God, and then you have all this other creation. You have animals, you have plants and all these different things. Well, I interpret that as God and his heavenly court and the unseen world. It's a mirror of that reality where you see tiers of intelligence, you see tiers of size and strength and utility in all of these creatures and plants that God has made. And so Adam is presiding over it as an image of God, presiding over the unseen world. And the cosmological model is also the Earth, and then all these other planets there's the microcosm where you get down to even cellular level, and then you explode out and you see this massive heavenly host, right? So you're getting these multiple images on multiple scales, seen and unseen, but also big to small. And you'll see that throughout the rest of Scripture if you start looking for it. It's actually everywhere, and it's constantly talked about and alluded to and cross-referenced. But the trees, or the tree in the center of the garden, is essentially the Holy of Holies. And Adam's job, so the word used for what he is supposed to do in cultivating and keeping, is the same word that's used for the priests who are given swords to protect the courts of the temple and keep any unclean thing from entering. And so even in the Israelite camp, you're having this cosmological model where there's this innermost place that is holy. Then you have this, clean and less clean, and then eventually to the camp, and then to outside of the camp, which is this outer darkness idea. And it's this same cosmological model where there's this pivotal center where the clean is, and then moving out from there are unclean things, and they're not supposed to come in. So when Satan enters the garden and Eve finds him there in the center, it's actually a sign that Adam has already failed, because he has not guarded the garden from an unclean thing entering in. And that his wife is the one who encounters it and not him, right? So there's these kind of multiple failures of, why are you there in the center of the garden? Why is this serpent there? What's going on here, that you all kind of infer later? And part of the inference is looking at things like the temple, looking at what Christ does, looking at how these similar images operate later. And you can look back and see, okay, I understand what was actually supposed to happen here. I see now that Adam had a responsibility that he didn't fulfill. And you could get kind of lost in the whole thing with the serpent, but what's interesting about it in relation to our topic is he tells them they'll be like gods. And that is the fundamental temptation. And just to zoom really back in specific to things like UFOs and the Bledsoes, is that's the same offer they're being given.
Yeah.
That's what's being telegraphed by these ideas of high technology and healing and all these different things, right? That this is the same lie that's being offered up. And it gets into the idea, too, of what is a religion? Because there's these questions around, if these things are doing good things, why are they bad? If Satan wants to make us like gods, why is it bad? Right? Except that you're submitting to a different authority. First, your own authority by making a decision about what's right and wrong to follow, and then you're subjecting yourself to Satan's authority. And I think for people like Ryan, that's just completely foreign concept to him. He doesn't understand, if these things seem good and are helping us, why aren't they good?
Just as a note for everybody too, that is the same lie of Mormonism, but we will get into that later in the season, because I'm doing an episode on that and the Black Hebrew Israelites and kind of their connection to like weird beliefs about Israel and things like that. So anyways, I just wanted to note that, like, the idea of not that you can like have a true communion with God, but you can become God is the lie of Mormonism. So I won't derail us, but there you go. I just wanted to drop that in there.
Once you have the right frame of reference, you start seeing these things and seeing them for what they are in all these different false beliefs. It just becomes more apparent that this is what's going on over and over again, and you can kind of call it out for what it is and name it, which frequently naming things defeats them, and that's good to do.
That sounds like a rabbit trail.
We won't go there. It's definitely a rabbit trail. Okay, so false religion coming under the authority of the serpent. And to kind of zoom forward again into the New Testament, where in Jude, he talks about these things being wandering stars. So if you're looking at these heavenly beings like Satan was, and I think there's a great case to be made that he was part of this divine council, that he was a member of the divine council, and what he's doing is he's being this two-tiered reality, right? He's being a host of heaven who is crossing over out of his proper domain and coming into the center of the temple. And that in itself is an unclean act. He should not have been there. He should not have gone in without permission, because he wasn't the high priest. He wasn't the figure who is allowed at the center of the temple. That was only God and Adam and Eve at this time. And to go off maybe on a tangent a little bit, but I'm of the opinion that Adam and Eve were always meant to eat from the fruit. So what they're supposed to receive from that is essentially an initiation into this council that God has, that includes these other beings that are represented by the planets, which we'll get to a little bit more on that. But stars and angels are synonymous in the Bible, and there's lots of places you can look and just see that that's the case. In Job and even in the New Testament, there are just clear statements that these things are stars. And we basically, and you'd think about stars differently, we don't differentiate in the Bible between planets and stars. It's kind of all the same thing, these heavenly bodies. Humanity has its own star. And so they were supposed to cultivate and fill our star, and we're supposed to be the first Adam. The second Adam is the firstborn among the dead. He is supposed to bring life and renewal and new creation. Adam was supposed to bring renewal and new creation, or he's supposed to cultivate creation on this planet. And my theory is, and people like Irenaeus would back up this idea. I'm extrapolating a little further than he would. I want to be clear about that, but he would say, kind of before Augustine gets into the idea that Satan was prideful, Irenaeus is putting forward the idea that he was envious. And so this is an idea that is, I think, fairly prominent in the early church, from my understanding, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's because Satan seems to see that humanity is going to rise into this place of power amongst the council. And that's represented by us getting a planet that we get to rule over. And the angels don't get that. And so the reason he comes down and comes into the garden is because he is envious of mankind, and he doesn't want them to rise into this place that eventually Christ takes. And this is where I'm going, of if you look forward to what Christ does, he enters into the heavenly places. He enters into the court of God and intercedes and is a representative for mankind in the court of God himself, and is seated at his right hand. I don't think Satan knew that that was the ultimate trajectory of a God-man who is going to take that role. He thought it was Adam who was going to do that, and he was jealous. And this gets into this idea that you find again throughout Scripture on this kind of micro-macro place of the older and younger brother. So if you're thinking about the cosmological mirror, and you're looking at Jacob and Esau, you're looking at the Pharisees and the Gentiles, you're looking at all of these brother figures, Joseph and his brothers, which interestingly enough, Joseph's vision is about the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him. And he is a foreshadowing of Christ. And he is seated at the right hand of Pharaoh, who is the greatest power, right, in their minds. And he is a microcosmic image of what Christ is going to do. And that involves the 12 tribes of Israel bowing down to him, and him being this mediator for them. And he winds up saving them, because he goes through this descent essentially into death, and then he rises up into power. And
that's like literally down into a pit where he's supposed to die.
That's right. Yeah. And there's echoes of this everywhere. So even Adam, he falls into a sleep, he comes out, and he has his bride, and Christ goes into the grave and comes out, and the church is created. It's his bride. And so you see these mirrors going on again, these different scales, but there's always these repetitious patterns and themes that you're supposed to be picking up on. And one of them is that the angels are also representative of that older brother motif. And the older brother, Cain, kills Abel, and he's one of the first seeds of the serpent. So when it says that the seed of man and the seed of the serpent will be at enmity, Cain is the older brother who kills his younger brother out of jealousy for God's favor for him. And it's a reenactment of Satan's fall and his attempt to destroy mankind. And in the New Testament, you see the Pharisees getting called sons of Satan, who is a murderer from the beginning, right? And so you start seeing these patterns where these fallen heavenly beings are this elder brother who are looking for their birthright like Esau was. They believe that they're owed something, and they don't think mankind is worthy of it. And even in passages where it talks about angels longing to look into these things and us judging angels, I think all those passages are illuminated when you kind of think through this idea of, why would we be judging angels? Why was Jesus made for a little while lower than the angels, like Hebrews says, and then he ascends into this place of power? It's because that's the destiny of mankind.
Right.
And the angels, the fallen ones, don't like that. But the obedient ones, Hebrews talks about them being basically made to serve us and our redemption. And so as you plug these passages into each other, you can start seeing this emerging worldview that these ancient people would have had about what the stars are and what angels are.
You know, an interesting place that I think maybe this pattern is there a little bit too, as I'm trying to think through it, is in the temptation in the wilderness when Satan comes to Christ and he tempts him, and he, you know, in this instance, you know, Satan does have like real authority in things because of the garden. At least that's my view, is that he's got real authority over the earth at this point. And so when he tempts Christ, and his final temptation is like, hey, bow down to me and I'll give you all these things, right? It's the easier way out for Christ in that situation. It's like, okay, well, Christ is actually going to go die and earn all these things, right? Christ gets everything. And purchases victory through his death. I'm like super post mill over here, so that's like a thing for me. But so Satan offers this, and Christ, unlike Adam, denies him in that temptation. So in one sense, you have this wicked angelic being who is trying to reproduce the garden fall, but in the wilderness, right? And then what happens immediately after that? The angels minister to him, right? So you have this, like, you have the faithless angel who's like trying to wreck the plan, and then when he fails, then the unfallen angels, they actually then come in and minister. They do exactly what you're talking about. They actually help to serve the righteous.
Yeah, and again, whole rabbit trail, but you can actually see in Christ's life, in his baptism and the wandering in the wilderness, and then his entrance into ministry, this pattern that follows these other figures in the Bible. So he passes through water and then goes into a waiting period in the wilderness where he's tempted. And then he comes out and he says he will give the sign of Jonah, which is about his death and resurrection. But then he goes out and starts casting out demons. And
spoiler alert, Jonah died. I'm just going to throw that out there. And
I believe that, actually. We can't go off on that one right now.
No. But, we'll talk about that on another podcast.
So the point being, in creation, right, land comes out of water. It's like this initial baptism where this habitable place is emerging out of water. And then you have this waiting period, like the wilderness, where Adam and Eve get tempted, just like Jesus is tempted. And then the goal was, right, that they would drive him out, and then they would enter into essentially the promised land. And that's what Jesus is preparing for his people, as he's going and he's saying, I'm going to drive out all these wicked powers and secure for you the promised land of the new heavens and the new earth. And that's what Adam was supposed to do. He was supposed to claim the new heavens and new earth. It's the same thing. And Israel does this as well, where they pass through the Red Sea and they come out into the wilderness where they're tempted and they fall again. And they're supposed to enter into the land and cast out the wicked inhabitants and claim it. And this is a tiny, again, cosmological model of what's going on in the heavenly realm. And so Christ defeating the cosmic powers, and Paul and different authors talk about this, and it's confusing if you don't have this paradigm of understanding. Why are we talking about this? Well, it's because the fallen beings are these cosmic powers, and Jesus is the true Israel. And so he is living out this faithful life, this faithful Adamic life, this faithful Abrahamic, Noahic, Davidic life, right? Where they all get tempted, they fall, they fail the test in that waiting period, and then they can't secure what they were meant to secure. And only Christ could have ever done that. But it's supposed to show you, once you see his success and how he's elevated to this position of power, what was intended for mankind.
Yep.
So you can read all the stories in light of that, which is super fascinating. Maybe isn't the only or main thrust, but it's definitely latent in the stories themselves and the way they're presented and the details that are given. So I brought a figure in there that relates to all this, which is Abraham. And I think we should go to him next because we talked about the 12 tribes, and this part's really interesting. So Abraham is called out of Ur of the Chaldeans. And when you look at Abraham's names in his family line, you can tell that they were moon worshippers. So they were pagans. And Joshua actually says that because I didn't even know where this was for a long time. I heard people say Abraham was a moon worshiper, and I always thought, where are they getting that idea from? It doesn't say that right in Genesis. And then I see in Joshua 24, 2-3, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods." And in Abraham's family, the names like Terah means moon, Haran, which means basically a city of moon god worship, and Sarai is named after the moon god's wife, and then his granddaughter Milcah is the moon god's daughter. And it's super interesting. I mean, there's probably some scholarly disputes over that, but it does seem pretty clear. And even from what Joshua says, they were pagans, right? They were pagans, and God called him out of this place. And in the immediate context, what you see is at the Tower of Babel, these people were trying to build a tower up to heaven and make a name for themselves. That language is what's used. And there's a lot of reasons why they might have been doing that. We don't need to get into that now, but that's what they were doing, right? They're trying to make some kind of contact with the heavens, and they want to make a name for themselves. And so God disperses them throughout the whole earth and confuses their language, which is probably maybe a religious term, actually, not necessarily a linguistic one mainly, but a shared religion. Joe Rigney actually has talked about that a decent amount. So ask him about it. But Abraham is told by God to look up at the stars when God is speaking to him. And that word there, people take it to maybe mean different things. But again, Jim Jordan even talks about this may have been an idea of kind of noting and marking the positions of the stars and thinking about their movements, perhaps. That's one possibility. But either way, he's coming out of a context of celestial worship. And then God is telling him, look up at these stars. And in the ancient perspective, in the ancient worldview, and coming out of where he was, when he looked up at those, he would have seen the gods.
Yeah.
That's what he would have been looking at. Yeah. And God is telling him he is a new Adam figure who is going to have a child, right? Eve says that she has gotten a man with the help of the Lord when Cain is born. And it's this promise that she thinks that the Messiah is going to come, not thousands of years later, but in the next generation is what she's expecting. Yeah. And Abraham and Sarah are old. And so there's this, again, this kind of new creation imagery being brought forth where God is saying, I'm going to make you into a new creation. And one of the things I'm going to do is you're going to possess this land that you're in, right? You're going to drive out the wicked inhabitants, the Canaanites, and you're going to possess this land, and your offspring are going to outnumber the stars. And when he says that to Abraham, what I think Abraham is hearing is your offspring are going to rule over the gods. That's what's being foreshadowed and promised to him, which is, again, the promise to Adam, that he would be elevated to this state of authority as mankind. In this place of
I think that's a really interesting thing to maybe park on just for a second.
Yep.
Because I think that oftentimes, and certainly growing up, this is sort of just how I took it, because I'm growing up in a context that's very modern or postmodern, post-enlightenment, certainly, and thinks about things kind of like when we were talking about science earlier. You know, everybody expects science to be mathematical computations and calculations and precision parts manufacturing and things like that, not like this weird esoteric sort of thought, right? And sometimes when we read scripture, we tend to fall into like reading it through a very scientistic or enlightenment lens. And so growing up, you know, when I read that phrase, and I've heard it preached, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong for people to preach it this way either, my mind went to mathematical equations, right? You look at the stars, there's so many there. This is about how many people are going to be part of the house of Israel. And I don't think it's not that, because I think there is this beautiful fulfillment in the gospel that there are many, 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 many people who come to faith through the faithfulness of Abraham and his faithful line, ultimately in Christ, right? But a couple years ago, as I was kind of digging into the quote unquote re-enchantment realm, one of the folks that I was listening to was, what are they called? It's called the Lord of the Spirits podcast.
Yeah.
And it's the Orthodox brothers. And they've been a little bit more attuned perhaps to the symbolic side of Christianity for longer. It's not as though Protestants weren't, and it's not as though the Western Church wasn't for a very long time. We just happen to live in a very weird pocket where symbolism is like totally lost on us, right? But it hasn't been, because they've actually worked really hard to preserve that in the Eastern Church. Sometimes to their detriment, in my opinion. But in this case, one of the things that they brought out is that, and I think it pairs well with what you're saying here, is when God told Abram at that time to look to the stars, right? And he said, well, your children are you're going to have as many children as the stars. You know, he's not just saying, hey, here's a numeric. It's not a quantitative thing. It's also a qualitative thing. And he would have seen the stars as angelic and or as gods. And so the promise would to him have been that it's not that the amount of your progeny will be this way, but also the quality of your progeny will be this way.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And I think it's interesting you brought up Lord of Spirits. I listen to them some, and a lot of these thoughts I have are just from reading deeply on the text, and then lo and behold, I go back and I go, oh, this isn't actually a novel idea. This is something that the church fathers were talking about, and I'm comforted by that fact that I'm not just spinning out ideas here constantly, even if I am making some connections that they may not have alluded to.
Yeah, if you have a novel idea, it's not good. If you have a thought and then you find out it's not novel, then you're usually safer. Not always. That's right. Sometimes it's heresy, but
but they're seeing it in the Bible, and if they can see it in the Bible and I can see it in the Bible, I think we're in a good spot.
Right.
But yeah, and I think the other thing to see with Abraham is this sense of, again, this two-tiered reality where God's pointing to the stars and saying, these things used to govern, right? And now your offspring is going to govern. So there's also this escalation, not just of quality and quantity, but of authority that's being handed over in this claiming of the heavens. And again, I think you can view Christ's work as a proof of this idea, that if you just look at what Jesus is doing as the true man and true God, that is what he's about. Yeah. And so you can see that there's this connection to the whole human race as represented by him. Okay. And now we're going to go a little bit further into the 12 tribes. And this is an interesting.
Yeah, let's do it. I think I know where you're going. I'm excited for it.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I should preface this again by go listen to the Lord of Spirits, look at some of the things they say about the Psalms. And in the Psalms, it talks about, I should know this, I feel like it's Psalm 19, but it's the one that talks about the stars proclaiming God's handiwork and the sun running its course, right? Like a bridegroom leaving his chamber and running his course with joy. There is a line in there that, pun not intended, but it's basically the word line or something like that of the stars. And I didn't know what that was. And so I was listening to Lord of Spirits, and they highlight actually that has to do with the signs of the zodiac, which might sound pretty surprising to people, but they're saying, don't think of it in terms of you read your newspaper, right, and you get your weird forecast about you're going to fall in love or something, but about the ancient worldview of they viewed a lot of the constellations that we consider, like Orion and different things. The book of Job talks about those constellations, and the ancient world had these constellations. They're actually fairly persistent, and it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Why do these things appear everywhere? Why do all these people have them? What's going on with this commonality? And it seems like this line language, it doesn't seem like it. It seems very clear that the sun's course and this idea of this line has to do with the path of the sun and how it relates to the zodiac and the 12 signs of the zodiac. So just as a little preface, this does appear elsewhere in the Bible. It's actually fairly prevalent, and you can find it if you know what to look for. And it doesn't mean you should go out and try to read the stars, but it does mean that they are relevant to us in this two-tiered cosmology that God has made, and we should know why.
Yeah. It is Psalm 19, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad. So Abraham's offspring, 12 tribes of Israel, right?
Yep.
There are 12 signs of the zodiac.
Yes, there are.
Surprise, surprise. And it's my position that human destiny is tied to the stars in that sense and what was intended for Adam. And you see that Josephus talks about these synagogues and places where there were depictions of the Hebrew Zodiac in synagogues during his time, and not only in synagogues, but he actually talks about that the Zodiac was on the temple curtain, which is the temple curtain, getting back to that cosmological model of the temple being a microcosm of the cosmos. The temple curtain is described as having angels on it, being embroidered with them, and having all these gemstones. And what those gemstones are representative of is the stars. And there's this idea going on here where the temple curtain, the sky, is shielding us from the Holy of Holies because we don't have access to that place yet. Only one person, the high priest, once a year can go in there and to make atonement for sins. The cherubim that wind up guarding the entrance to the garden, I think, are connected to this veil. So there are this blocking of access back to the holy place and to access to fellowship with God. And so even the Tower of Babel, the temple, all these different things are actually representing that there is a barrier between us and God, and it's sort of mediated by looking at the heavens, and that the heavens are like a veil that the New Testament describes will be torn when Christ returns. And when Christ died, that veil was also torn because he was eliminating this barrier to us entering back into this place of fellowship with God that was being essentially mediated by the angels. And Paul talks about the law being mediated through angels and different things like that. And I think it brings up this whole picture of the heavenly host mediating, in a sense, between man and God. The 12 tribes are associated with the zodiac. And so when Jacob blesses his sons and he gives them these blessings that include references to animals, those are actually in the Hebrew Zodiac. They're not always like totally, there's a little bit of questions around a few of them, but it's actually pretty clear. And the way that the Israelites camped around the temple and the tabernacle is actually indicative of those constellations, basically representing a mirror of the heavens around the temple, which is super interesting. And there's a lot more you could dig into there, but it relates to them going into the land of Canaan and overthrowing these powers that are serving false gods. And so the job of the Israelites is to drive out the unclean things, the representatives of the fallen host of heaven. And so their whole job is Adamic, essentially, of cleansing out the promised land of these mirrors of divine fallen powers. And you'll frequently see that in texts where there are oracles against these pagan kings that God gives that are seemingly addressing men, but then they also say things that make you think they're addressing spiritual powers, and they're also addressing things that are stars. So you'll frequently find this multi-layered imagery, and what's going on there, I think, is that you have this tiered cosmology, and it's being represented in human and angelic powers. And so when the Israelites are driving these people out, they're actually foreshadowing Christ's victory over the fallen powers. And it's this image that will be played out in redemptive history as well.
I saw that you had this as I was looking through your mind map, and I wasn't exactly sure how you were going through all of those things, linking those things all together. But it's interesting. I went down a similar rabbit trail, not as much here, but again in like Jewish tradition, right? And some of their folklore. There is actually a linking as well. And I don't know how aware you are or not, but it's actually, a lot of people don't know this. A lot of Christians who are listening to this podcast probably don't know this, and then they're going to feel really weird about it. But that's actually where our birthstones come from, is from the Hebrew Zodiac.
Yeah.
They're related to the 12 tribes of Israel and the stones that were on the breastplate of the high priest. So, and of course, there's different versions of what your birthstones are that have arisen throughout the years, but generally that's like kind of where they come from. And so those things are actually meant to relate to different, the different tribes, right? And so we have 12 because and then they go with our 12 months, and those go with different astrological signs and things like that. And that's why they don't match to our 12-month perfectly, right? Or the astrological signs don't. So there's like a little bit of skullduggery that happens on what you're doing there, but that's where the original relationship comes from, is the birthstones come from the breastplate stones. And I thought that was interesting because when you were talking about the tapestry, right, the veil there that Christ tore at his death, the high priest would wear that breastplate, right? He would actually march himself in with the tribes, essentially. And that's kind of, you read through those passages about his whole get up and things, especially when you're a kid and you're just like, oh man, what is going on? Why are we going on about all of like this, sewing and ornamentation and all these things? It gets really dry. But what you realize, if you're really paying attention, is, okay, what's happening is the high priest is actually donning the whole people when he goes in, right? Which is essentially what Christ does through his death, but he tears the veil so that, and he never leaves, right? He never leaves the presence, and he's constantly there for us, representing us. And so, it was interesting as you were talking about that. I was thinking about the birthstones and like the priest literally marching the people in that connection that a lot of Christians probably don't know. And so, if you're terrified of your like mother's ring that you're wearing now because you're listening to this, which is statistically unlikely because I don't know if you know this, but mostly men listen to this podcast. So if you're a lady, you are one of the wonderful few, and we appreciate you. Don't throw away, your mother's ring there. It's
That's
okay
right.
for you to wear those stones.
That's right. That brings up an interesting thing as I was looking into this, and I was just looking. So this is part of my kind of exegetical methodology. Is I find interesting words and I
Mm,
go and look them up in Hebrew and I look for where else they occur in the Old Testament. And as I was looking into stars, I found a very interesting connection in Isaiah 14:13, where he's talking about the king of Babylon. And he says, "You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will
mm,
ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit." And if you're thinking about what's going on there, the motivation of a king, a pagan king, or a heavenly being is counter to what the priest is doing, where he is entering into this model of the highest heavens and he's bringing humanity in there with him, the 12 tribes, right, which are replaced by the 12 apostles, which is another older, younger brother comparison. But this pagan king thinks that he can go to the Mount of Assembly where the council of God gathers and he can make himself God. He can enter into the holy place, which is described as being above the stars, right? So
mm,
this view of the holy place is somewhere beyond the stars, beyond the veil of the temple, and humanity in Christ are the ones who can actually enter there and find a seat. So Christ takes that seat that the pagan king wanted and thought he could have, but instead
mm.
he's cast down and Christ is raised up.
Yeah, that's great. So I think, for the sake of listeners, we are probably ought to start trying to bring this together. Then move towards a landing point. So I guess the question that I have then is, we have this wealth of biblical understanding and evidence of, hey, there are these beings that are taking this role of like a usurper, seemingly out of envy, which, by the way, I think you're onto something there, both because of Irenaeus, but also, I don't know if you've read The Spine of Scripture by Non-Tenant, which we talked about in last
Yep.
season, but he takes a very similar angle and kind of does more of a reformed treatise of Michael Heiser view of things. So
Mm-hmm.
if you haven't read that, or if people haven't read that, that's also a really good primer, I think, that is right in line with what you're saying. So, so how do we link these two things together, right? And what do we actually do with it, right? Because that's one of the things that I want to make sure that we're always doing here on the podcast for everybody who's listening. Is it's great to talk about all these things, and this has been awesome. um, and I hope everybody has, like melted brains in the ways that we like. But what do we do with it? How do we apply that now today with what we're seeing? Maybe even in particular to where we started things, like in this whole UFO, UAP disclosure, like that is coming in like a flood right now. So like, what do we do with that?
Yeah. So to connect it, I think you have to go back to places like Jude 1:13 through 14 that talk about false teachers being compared to wandering stars. And it
Hmm.
gets back to this two-tiered universe where wandering stars create new religions because they are
Hmm.
going against God's divine order and what he intended for mankind. And they are subverting the idea that humanity would have this place through Christ and that Christ himself would take this place. And so their motivation seems to be, again, if these things are healing and doing good things, well, it seems to be to distract you by any means
Hmm.
from being obedient to God. And so their whole goal, even through acts of compassion, kindness, elevating humanity, are actually to keep you from what you're promised in Christ. Christ is the one who secures those promises of salvation and wholeness and the new heavens and new earth. That's the only way that you can enter into the true promised land, into this new Eden. And these fallen beings or false teachers, whether Chris Bledsoe is just a false teacher like you see in the New Testament, or whether there's really something spiritual on a higher level going on, oftentimes it's both. And they're both interested in keeping you from your true nature that you're to receive in Christ in union with him. They want you to try to eat from the tree before it's time. So they try to offer you gifts. And I think that's really my takeaway. And Second Corinthians even says Satan comes as an angel of light. And so if you encounter something that is seemingly good, but it preaches something that is contrary to the gospel, you can know that it actually does not have your best in mind.
Yeah.
It does not have your salvation in mind. It probably has its own well-being in mind, actually, and it's trying to subvert what Christ has promised.
Yeah, oftentimes those entities or agents, whatever phrase you want to use for it, right? Beings, they are not concerned about you in anything other than utilizing you towards some end. And I think it's important for us to understand. On the flip side, on sort of the more like material view of things, one of the things that I've seen growing, and in one sense, I don't think it's a bad thing. In another sense, we ought to always be cautious, right? Is you got a guy like Elon Musk, and I talked in last season with Glenn Sunshine about techno-paganism and how a lot of these guys are into some esoteric stuff. And I don't know what Musk is up to or not.
Yeah.
I do know that he was Anglican at birth. And so depending on, people's covenantal convictions, he's either apostate or just was never connected to anything at all. But, here you have a guy who is super, super concerned about the continuation of the human race, almost at all cost, right? That is the moral bright line for him. And so you have this thing that seems really, at worst, kind of benign, but at best, like incredible, like going to Mars, making life interplanetary. All those things sound awesome, right? They sound super cool, but how different really is that from, building the Tower of Babel? Symbolically speaking, at least, right? Like you're talking about someone whose desire is to elevate mankind above mankind's station, literally to elevate man's station to the stars. Last time we did that, we had the help of the Nazis. So, and depending on who you talk to today, that's either a really big plus or a really huge drawback. So, but don't jump on X if you're not there. But there are things I think we ought to just be cautious about as Christians, and not assume that because this thing is nice and shiny and exciting that it is necessarily the right thing, or that it's necessarily neutral, right? There might be something more malicious there than we think. And you see things like that. And, a guy like Elon Musk who has 14 kids by 4 different moms. And I don't know whether or not he intends to like raise them as his children or not. I saw something today that it's like only 2 of them were non-IVF. And so he's like the ultimate step towards transhumanism. And that's a real concern. because I think transhumanism is fundamentally esoteric in its undergirdings and in its principles. So, and it's just we just got to be cautious. That's all I'm saying.
I think that's actually a helpful way to frame up lots of things. It doesn't just have to be encounters with spiritual beings. It can also be things where people are constantly asking, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with wanting to do these different things? And I think if you're looking at it from this Genesis perspective, where there is a time and place for a lot of these things, and it's under God's timing and authority. Jesus waited for the right time and the right place to take what belonged to him, and that was the temptation, right? That Satan gives him is take it now under my authority. Don't wait, don't suffer. And so there's this calling of you can't just go and take the easiest route to whatever you want. And Elon is kind of almost like a Solomon figure in a lot of ways, where he may have started off with wisdom, but now he is just grasping for what is not his. He's trying to take that fruit and become a god. And anytime you see that anything outside of Christ that promises that type of benefit is for your destruction, and it will be, unfortunately, for his, unless he comes to faith.
Yep. And we pray he does. And we pray for everybody who is listening that is not a Christian that you do too. It's one of the main reasons why we continue to do this podcast, is because we are unabashedly Christian. Sometimes we get some hate for it on some of our more recent episodes, at least on YouTube. We've had some fun hate mail. So if you're listening to this and you know it's you, congratulations, you got mentioned. But yeah, so, well, great. White Owl, it has been wonderful finally meeting you, even though I'm just meeting you as White Owl, and there's this, dead stare white avatar that anybody who's going to be watching this video can see, but the listeners can't see. And I found myself just like staring at it, and I thought, this is kind of strange, but but it gave me something to connect with. But it's been great meeting you. And yeah, I guess, why don't you tell folks, if you want, whatever you want to disclose, where they can follow you, if you have any anonymous Twitter handles or X handles you want to share, or if that's just the Discord, then that's the place to get the goods,
I'll just put in another plug for the Discord and all the great people there. We have good memes and theological discussions, so definitely get on there.
We have the best memes, and I guarantee you that 60% of the people in the Discord can't understand them, and no one outside the Discord can at all. So it's pretty great. So yeah, great plug for the Discord. Links to the Discord, all of our social media, all those things will be in the description. I'll also put links to some resources based off of the things that we talked about today. Any books that we mention or anything like that, I'll put in the links as well. Those will be affiliate links that we get a little bit of a kickback just to help offset some costs, like the cost of Zoom every month. And, maybe one of these days I can upgrade my mic, and I did actually upgrade to a new light. So anybody who's watching, you can see the other half of my face, which is pretty cool. But yeah, so we'll leave it there. But thanks for listening, everyone, and stay tethered.